Today, we're going to be diving deep into my bike setup on my Commencal Tempo, and I'm going to be sharing with you my top pieces of advice to maximize the performance of your short travel trail bike. In order to get every bit of performance possible from my Tempo, I have tested a wide range of parts from different forks to different shocks and different tire setups. As a result of all of this testing, I have settled on a bike setup that allows my Tempo to punch way above its weight class and truly makes me reconsider if I even need a long travel trail bike in my quiver as well. So let's get into it. To start things off, let's take a look at the frame. For me, I am 5 foot 11 inches tall, and I have found in the past that I tend to prefer bikes that are around the 460 millimeter reach mark, and that put me right in between choosing a medium and a large of this bike, and I decided to go for the large, which has a reach of 470 millimeters. The reason that I went up in size on this bike as opposed to down to the medium is that with the Commencal Tempo, when you go from a medium to a large, you get a bigger chainstay. So the large has a 440 millimeter chainstay, and the medium has a 435 mil chainstay. In the past, I had rode a lot of bikes with around a 435 mil chainstay and never a 440. So I wanted to test it out, and that was kind of the deciding factor for me with going to the large frame. And in addition, I did like the idea of the slightly longer wheelbase overall for some more stability, given that it is a short travel bike. To touch a little bit more on sizing and wheelbase, I want to compare this current Tempo to my previous short travel bike, which was a YT Izzo. The YT Izzo was my first short travel bike and really made me fall in love with this category of bike in general. And that bike, I did the opposite of this. I sized down to a medium, which had a 450 millimeter reach and a wheelbase of 1183 millimeters. Now, in contrast, this has the reach of 470, as I mentioned previously, and an overall wheelbase of 1238.5. Now, having spent a ton of time on both bikes, although not exactly back to back, they've had a few months of space in between my riding periods, I have found that the overall bigger wheelbase of the Tempo and reach to bring a ton of stability and confidence to this bike and really allows me to ride it that much harder than I was able to ride my previous Izzo. This brings me to my first piece of advice on how to maximize the performance of a short travel trail bike, and that is to pay very close attention to the size and overall wheelbase of the bike that you're riding. If you're someone who may be looking at a bike like this Tempo and you may be in between sizes, within reason, I would definitely recommend sizing up. In my personal experience, I've done both. I've ridden the smaller 450 reach Izzo with the shorter wheelbase and this bigger Tempo, and I have found this Tempo to give me way more confidence out there on the trail. Given that this is a little bit bigger than my preferred size, what I've done to compensate is I've changed my cockpit setup. So I've tossed some spacers under the stem to bring the stem towards me, and I've gone for a high rise bar. I got the new 40 mil rise race face era handlebar, which I have been so impressed by. And these two changes of the spacers and the 40 mil rise bar bring the grips closer to me, which gives me more leverage over the front end of the bike and allows me to ride with full confidence out there on the trail. Now that we've discussed the advantages of the high handlebar setup on this bigger frame for me personally, I do just want to discuss one downside, which is that running a high front end does limit the amount of weight placed over your front axle, which can lead to a lack of front wheel traction. This has just been something that I've been aware of and kind of riding around, but it has not led to any issues out there on the trail. Thankfully, I have a ton of trust in my tires, especially this brand new Maxxis high roller, which I have mounted up on the front, and traction has not been an issue. Now, to wrap up frame details, let's just talk briefly about climbing fitment, and that has been great, no problems whatsoever. I've got a 200 mil dropper post, which fits great in this frame, which is always good to see. Title MS1 seat. And yeah, overall, I would say as a 5'11" guy, size large Tempo, fits awesome, really pumped on it. Now, let's take a look at my suspension and how I maximize traction and comfort on my Tempo. When I first built up this bike, I went for a lighter weight suspension setup than I have on the bike right now. So I went for the Z2 from Marzo, which is a 34 mil stanchion at 140 millimeters of travel. And in the rear, I went for the brand new Bomber inline 210 by 50, small little guy. And overall, that suspension worked really, really well. It was actually my first time running both of those products, and I was blown away by both. Both handled really rough terrain surprisingly well, to be honest with you. But in an endless pursuit of trying to maximize the performance of this bike, I wanted to try a little bit of a beefier setup. So I swapped things out to a Z1 up front. This is the updated version with the rail damper at 150 mils of travel, so 10 mil more travel. And I went to the Bomber Air in the back, still 210 by 50, so no sizing change there, but just went to the bigger shock with piggyback. With the fork change, the biggest area where I noticed a difference between the Z2 and the Z1 was in hard compressions, specifically this one on trestle DH, where I really had to nose my front wheel in and had to be quite accurate with its placement. The 34 mil stanchion of the Z2 definitely held up, but felt a tad bit squirmy considering I was riding a trail fork on a downhill track. But the 36 mil stanchion of the Z1 was just quite a bit more confidence inspiring in instances like that. Now with that said, overall the Z2 handled really, really well, but I will continue running the Z1 moving forward just for the added confidence when things get a little bit gnarly out there. Taking a look now at the rear shock switch up, where I noticed the biggest difference between the Bomber Inline and the Bomber Air was in regards to how planted each shock felt. The Bomber Inline definitely brought a more playful vibe to the tempo, which I really enjoyed. But in certain instances, specifically in steep terrain, it definitely wasn't quite as planted and confidence inspiring. With that said, what you gain with the Bomber Inline is a better pedaling platform and more pedaling efficiency from my experience. Now, even though you lose a little bit of pedaling efficiency with the Bomber Air, in my opinion, the gains that I felt and experienced out there in steep sections was well worth it. The reason that you have better traction with the Bomber Air is it has the piggyback, so there's more oil flowing around in there. You have 2 stages of compression tuning and a lower IFP pressure, which makes this shock a lot more supple, giving you better traction. And that is exactly what I felt out there on the trail. This just really raised my confidence in steep terrain and allowed me to really give this bike a proper thrashing. Now, I started off with the base tune of this rear shock for the first few rides, and then I hit up Dirt Labs in Longmont, Colorado, and they hooked me up with a light rebound and a light compression tune for the Bomber Air. So why did I get a light compression tune on my Bomber Air rear shock? Well, that leads me perfectly to my next piece of advice on how to maximize the performance of your short travel trail bike, and that is to make sure your small bump sensitivity is on point. Small bump sensitivity is really crucial on a short travel bike because you need to do everything in your power to smooth out the ride as much as you can. Obviously, riding with line choice is a huge factor in that, but getting the bike set up right first is also important. So you need your spring rate dialed, your volume spacers dialed, and then for me, I take this one step further and I went for the light compression tune to make this thing as supple as possible. And so far it has been feeling awesome. With that said, this is not me telling you to go and custom tune your rear shock. What is most important is to have your spring rate absolutely dialed and to make sure you have the correct amount of volume spacers for your riding style so you have just enough bottom out resistance. This is definitely a really important thing to take your time on. You have a little bit of a more narrow window to get your setup right on a short travel bike just because you have less suspension than on something like a 180 mil travel, long travel enduro bike. So getting your spring rate dialed is super important. I really cannot stress that enough. It's important with all bikes and all suspension, but on a short travel bike, it is super, super important. Now that we've taken a look at my suspension setup, let's dive into my tires. But before we do, if you're enjoying the video, please give it a like and please consider subscribing for more videos like this in the future. When I first built up the Tempo and I had the lightweight suspension on the bike, I decided to opt for a tire setup to match. So I went for dual DHRs because they're fast rolling compared to an Assegai DHR setup. And I went for a double down casing in the rear and an EXO Plus casing in the front. So kept it pretty conservative on the casings overall. However, as I got more aggressive on this bike and I went to the 150 fork and the Bomber Air rear shock. I kind of was feeling like I needed a little bit more of aggressive of a front tire. So I went for the brand new Maxxis High Roller 3 in the downhill casing. My reasoning for going to the downhill casing is that's the only casing the tire was available in at the time. So I probably would have gone double down, but hey, here we are, and this tire absolutely eats. I have been very, very impressed with it. Just really stoked overall. Don't have enough good things to say in my testing so far. And then when the DHR2 got a little tired, I swapped out to the Dissector, which I don't have any conclusive thoughts on right now. I'm not super familiar with that tire, but I'm excited to get to know it better. And overall, this brings me to my next point of how to set up a short travel bike for maximum thrashing, and that is to not skimp on your tire setup. Having a heavy duty tire casing on a bike like this is really important. Tires are your first form of suspension, and running a heavier casing will give you a more damped ride and smoother feel overall. So having good tires mixed with a good suspension setup is the best way to have the most confidence on a bike like this Tempo. To wrap up this breakdown of my custom built Commencal Tempo, let's take a look at my wheels, drivetrain, and brakes. So for wheels, we have the brand new Aero wheel from Raceface. This is their new carbon offering. Super impressed with these so far. And for drivetrain, we got the old trusty Shimano XT, got the 10 to 50 one-tooth rear cassette in the 165 mil crank, and mounted up to the crank, we've got the Shimano Saint SPD pedal. Can't go wrong with any of those products. They always do the job. Now for brakes, we have the Shimano XT for piston brakes with 180 mil rotors front and rear. This brings me to my last piece of advice on how to maximize the performance of a short travel trail bike, and that is that I would advise running metal brake pads. My reasoning for this is metal brake pads deal with heat better than a resin brake pad will. And most short travel bikes are going to come with smaller rotors, which due to a greater amount of rotations generate more heat. So having a metal pad will be of benefit to you. Now, I strongly prefer resin pads, so this actually takes a lot for me to say, but it is something I would recommend, and it will help you maximize the performance of your short travel bike. So there we have it. I hope all of these small pieces of advice that I've mentioned throughout this bike check can help you with your bike setup and help you have a better time out there on the trail. If you have any questions about my bike setup, please drop a comment below. I'll definitely get back to you, and thank you so much for watching. Peace.